this is a normal Tuesday Grand Round, except we're DEMS and we're sponsoring a Grand Round once every couple of months, just so that you learn about DEMS, which is the Devon and Exeter Medical Society, and we in DEMS learn about some of the stuff that goes on Tuesday lunchtime as well. And it's to give particularly junior doctors and other hospital staff a chance to join us in DEMS. So DEMS, Devon and Exeter Medical Society, second oldest medical society in the country, founded in 1780. The oldest one, of course, was London, founded in 1773. So it's quite historic. If you're a consultant or a GP, do think about joining. It's not very much, it's about £37 a year, I think. But all the meetings, otherwise, if you're in a trainee or whatever, you're welcome at all the meetings. There's no charge to come to any of the meetings. It's just we rely on financial support to keep things going from the higher earners, we should say. So that's DEMS. Junior Doctors Forum, I should mention there is information about that on the website, and the Junior Doctors Writing Competition, which is coming up and will be in our meeting in July on a Tuesday lunchtime. Usually very popular. Short piece of written work, can be a bit of research, can be an audit, can be a quality improvement, can be actually a poem or a bit of creative writing, something experience about your training. It can be in multiple factors, but it's always worth thinking about entering that. We had some fantastic entries last year. People's personal reflections of perhaps an incident or something like that, and there is a financial prize for those that are lucky and win that. So think about doing that. Something to put on the CV as well. However, today we are here to talk. I'm delighted to welcome Kelly Thornber, who's come up this morning on the train from Penryn. Did you get the sleeper, was it, or it was all 6 hours sort of on the grind? Kelly is talking about the Pharma Pollution Hub, and I don't know exactly what that is yet, but we're going to find out. But I do know it's all about reducing the environmental impact of medicines used in UK health and care. At medical school, I was never taught anything about what happens. I was taught about, what happens to medicine when it is absorbed by the patient and how it's metabolized in the patient and what its physiological effects are in the patient, and then it's excreted and it goes away. All 99.9% of the chemical is either pooed or peed out by the patient. And goes into the water system. It's not removed in sewage treatment, and it gets into the environment. And of course, we're prescribing more and more medications for more and more people, which are a wonderful thing. We've heard of antibiotic resistance, but there's much bigger problem than that. There's also a problem at the other end in the manufacture of medicines, the effluent from pharmaceutical manufacturing, which goes on in all parts of the world, where some places have strong environmental regulation, but other cheaper generic drugs, which we're often advised to prescribe on the NHS because it saves a bit of money, may be manufactured in places where the environmental laws are not as good as they are within the EU. So we might actually be doing more damage to the environment and more damage to the future health of our patients and future generations by prescribing slightly cheaper generics than ones that are made within the UK or Europe under stricter regulations. Kelly is, I think, did an original degree at Nottingham in biochemistry. You went to Oxford Balliol College, where you did a DPhil in biochemistry again. You've worked for Wellcome. You've worked in Bangladesh, looking at. Talk about that now. You're going to talk about that. You worked all over the world, actually, in the field. You looking at how to improve and reduce pollution in some of the industries. You've worked in communication. You've done an amazing number of different projects and research, and now you're a joint founder of this Pharma Pollution Hub, which you're going to talk about today. So, welcome, Kelly Thornber. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks a lot, Tim. And yeah, I'm delighted to be able to share my work with you. As Tim said, I mean, Tim's already introduced a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about already, so it's a great introduction. Yeah, I'm going to talk about my work, which is really interlinked with the Pharma Pollution Hub, which is a new think tank that we're just setting up at the moment. And I'm a researcher based at the university, so I'm based down in Penryn. But what I do, oh no, it's not working. There we go, a bit slow. What I do is a bit different to normal research, and I really like this cartoon because it really exemplifies what it is I do. So I work in sustainable development issues related to the environment. Quite often we see this problem. We know, there we go. We know where we're at, we know where we want to get to, but how do we actually get there is another complicated question. And most of these issues, these sustainable development issues, are really complex. They're really deep rooted in society. And so the solutions aren't simple. The solutions and the problem usually they involve social issues, economic issues, politics, cultural, technical. And so to find solutions, you first of all have to understand the complexity of the issue and then work across all of these different areas to develop the solutions. And so my research actually spans, it's very multidisciplinary. So it is researching how this miracle bit in the middle, it's researching how this works. And so I am completely reliant on the expertise of all these other people. I sort of specialize, if you like, in the top level of the whole thing. And just very quickly, I've got 2 slides explaining how I got into this in the first place. So about 7 years ago, I started a project looking at pharmaceutical pollution in Bangladesh aquaculture ponds. And so fish and shrimp ponds, we were looking at pharmaceutical pollution and in particular antimicrobial resistance and looking for evidence of risk. And the 3 main risk factors in these ponds are the prevalence of resistant microbes. So we were looking at genetics, high pharmaceutical usage, particularly antibiotics, and high levels of human and animal exposure. And not that surprisingly, we found all of this. And so we find that there's very high levels of AMR risk. And so I was then interested as a scientist, you know, we can evidence that there is risk. We can evidence that this pollution is causing a problem, but how do we actually translate that into real world impact and translate the evidence into societal change? And so I started looking at why. So why are there loads of resistant microbes in these ponds? Why is there high pharmaceutical usage? And why do these people and the animals have to go into the ponds in the first place? And so I started moving away from the science a bit more and starting to look at the socioeconomic, cultural, political factors that are driving AMR risk. And I'm not going to go into this, but just to say that what you start seeing is that this is actually this very complex system of factors. And actually, when you look at the root of the problem, the reasons why, say, farmers are using loads of antibiotics in their ponds is because the water coming into their ponds is filthy. You know, there's upstream industrial pollution and all sorts. There's very low biosecurity, so there's very high levels of infectious disease. These farmers are using antibiotics because they have no choice. They're doing it to survive. And so whereas you've got these strategies, antimicrobial resistance strategies that are focused on the farmer and saying to the farmers, stop using antibiotics, they can't easily because they have no choice. So we have to look at the whole system to be able to really drive large-scale change. So that's where this came from. And then about 3 years ago, I started looking at, okay, here we are in Bangladesh, talking about to government and farmers about pollution. What about our backyard? Are we actually doing a good job here? Should we be the people going over there and saying this to them? And And so I started looking at pharmaceutical pollution and UK healthcare. And actually, there's quite a lot of parallels. So, we have a high and rising dependence on pharmaceuticals, which I'll talk about more in a moment. We actually have pretty poor monitoring of environmental levels. I mean, over in Bangladesh, there's no monitoring at all. We have very little here, in fact. Again, there's this individualistic focus on prescribers or on patients to, rather than this systems focus more, it is still quite individualistic. And we have a lack of pragmatic solutions. How are we really going to reduce antibiotic usage, across healthcare on a large scale? But importantly, what I saw is a lack of an independent body. So whereas in Bangladesh, we have the United Nations, we have loads of NGOs, big international organisations that are working kind of for the greater good, we don't really have that here. And so that's where the idea for the Pharma Pollution Hub came in. So we are an independent think tank accelerating collective action to reduce the environmental impact of pharmaceutical pollution. So at the moment, we're working on UK healthcare, but the idea is that we're an independent body that brings people together. So inclusive solutions, these are the two main things, our kind of key aspects. We focus on systems and we focus on inclusive solutions. So that means bringing stakeholders from all different parts of the system together to make solutions that work for all of them as much as possible. Because if you don't, then this isn't going to be a long-term change. And just background, so I'm a co-director with Charles Tyler, who's an ecotoxicologist, also based at Exeter. We've been funded so far by the University of Exeter, Wellcome Trust, and the Medical Research Council, and we have a fantastic advisory committee as well. So I'll come back to that in a bit, but what I wanted to do, first of all, is go through with you in terms of UK healthcare and pharmaceutical pollution, where are we now? And then what do we want to achieve? And then how we can get there. And that's where what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time. So where are we now? So this is global human pharmaceutical market. So it's currently, well, in 2022, it was worth about 1.5 trillion US dollars. It is still growing. It's expected to reach 1.9 trillion by 2027. And the main reason for this is our population growth. So you can see, this is the global population, which is increasing. We're here. And importantly, this is the rate of growth, and which is going down. So the bulk of the population growth is because we're aging. And as we age, of course, we suffer from more chronic diseases. And of course, that's associated with increasing pharmaceutical usage. So this is a pattern. It's expected to continue to increasing. This is the UK now. So this is the UK pharmaceutical market, currently about £60 billion, and again, expected to increase. These are the top 10 dispensed chemicals. You can see most of it is chronic diseases. And just to paint a picture of our increasing dependency, this is the number of pharmacists, which has been going up for quite a long time. This is the number of wholesalers, and some sort of disturbing facts that about 15% of people in England take 5 or more medicines every day. And of course, this increases as people get older, they typically take more. Drugs are the second biggest cost, and they're rising faster than the annual NHS increase in funding. We know at least 10% of drugs that are prescribed are unnecessary, so that's just a waste of resources. And of course, the more we prescribe and use, the more we have adverse drug reactions, the more we have increased drug dependency problems, and these all come with an increasing cost as well. So we are dependent on pharmaceuticals, and this is getting worse. Now, the environmental impacts of pharmaceuticals, so this is one of the main reasons why this is not sustainable. This is the planetary health boundaries model. So you'll see there's 9 planetary health boundaries. This circle here is the safe operating space. So the idea is, if we want a long-term sort of human-Earth relationship, or a good one at least, We need to stay within this green circle, and this is climate change. You can see we've exceeded that quite a lot already. This is obviously what people talk about most, and what the NHS is really focused on. This is novel entities, so this is where pollution sits. That means it's things that aren't natural, so things like chemicals, plastics, pharmaceuticals are included in this. So this is pollution. You can see it's even worse than climate change. This is biodiversity, which is heavily linked to pollution. Well, they're all linked, but this is obviously hugely overshot. So, and pharmaceutical pollution mainly is sort of involving this boundary and this boundary, as well as freshwater usage. But before I talk about pharmaceutical pollution, pharmaceuticals also have a substantial carbon footprint. So most pharmaceuticals are derived from crude oil. This is quite old data now, but the pharmaceutical industry produces more carbon per year, or at least it did in 2015, than the automotive industry. It's really highly carbon dependent. And you'll all probably know this. This is the NHS England carbon footprint, and medicines make up 25% of that as well. So yeah, pharmaceuticals have a carbon footprint, but in terms of pollution, so the drugs we use are entering the environment all the time. Tim talked about excretion. So depending on the drug, it's up to 90% of the drugs we consume are excreted. They can be excreted unchanged, they can be excreted metabolized, and the metabolized forms can be more or less active, or active in a different way. And our wastewater treatment systems weren't designed to remove chemicals, they were designed to remove organic matter. So the amount that's removed varies quite a lot, but many pharmaceuticals are not completely removed from wastewater treatment. So they're entering our environment. This is a study that showed that only 27% of people in the UK are thought to actually take their medicines, their unused or expired medicines, back to pharmacies for safe disposal. So these are either getting thrown down the sink or the toilet, or going into landfill. Of course, this also enters wastewater. Landfill, we know pharmaceuticals can leach out of landfill sites and get into the environment that way as well. And, oh, is that? That's all right now. And manufacturing is another major source. So we have about 700 manufacturing sites in the UK. As Tim said, increasingly we're looking abroad, or even within the manufacturing in the UK, the supply chains are often abroad. And sometimes downstream of these manufacturing facilities can be at really, really high levels. So at one place in India, there's a number of antibiotic manufacturing facilities all in the same place. The river downstream of that was found to have levels of antibiotics higher than that found in the blood of a patient. This can be really high levels. So thankfully, that's not in the UK, but we do manufacture in the UK as well. Unsurprisingly, because of all this, pollution is increasing. This is a study from a couple of years ago that looked at about 250 rivers across the world and found carbamazepine, metformin, and caffeine. So drugs that are prescribed heavily. So this is a neuroactive drug. Carbamazepine, metformin is a diabetes drug. Caffeine is obviously a drug that we all use. It is officially a pharmaceutical. So these were found at 50%, more than 50% of all sites around the world. And at more than 25% of sites, one or more of these active pharmaceutical ingredients, these drugs, were found at concentrations that we know can cause ecological impact. So this is a problem, and pharmaceuticals are actually found at quite low levels in the environment. So it's only recently that the technologies are really getting good enough to detect them. And so far, the more we're looking, the more we can find. I mentioned that pharmaceuticals are found typically at low concentrations, but they're designed to be active at low concentrations. So this is concerning. We design them to be active at low concentrations because we want to minimize the side effects in our bodies. So they're active, physiologically active. They're also designed to pass through biological membranes because, of course, they need to get to where they need to go to in our body. And of course, that happens in wildlife as well. And often the targets are conserved across species, because if something is evolutionarily conserved, typically that means it's important, and therefore it's a stronger target for drugs. And some of the impacts that we see, so you might have heard of feminization of fish from the estrogens. Antidepressants are causing fish to become more bold and take more risks, so they're more susceptible to predation. And there's quite a lot of impacts. The literature on this is increasing, and it's not just fish, it's also invertebrates, amphibians, birds. There's a really famous example of vultures in India where pretty much the whole kind of species is wiped out because they were using diclofenac in cattle, and the vultures were feeding on the cattle carcasses, and it's really highly toxic to vultures. So yeah, but normally the impacts of pharmaceutical pollutants, they don't sort of wipe out species normally. There's very few examples of this. They have sort of long-term impacts on, reproduction, survival, behaviour. And so this is causing long-term biodiversity loss, but it's very, very difficult to measure. You can imagine we've got thousands of different chemicals in an environment, and we have thousands of different species. So knowing what the impacts of these are going to be is very difficult to comprehensively have the data for. And it is getting there slowly, but it's very complex. And not only is the problem that we don't have enough understanding of the risks, but we don't have enough understanding of what's actually there. So this is the European Commission's Water Framework Directive. This is the laws about monitoring pollutants in our environment. And so we have the priority list at the top, which are the chemicals that countries in the EU, when we used to be in the EU, these are the chemicals that they have to measure. And there's no pharmaceuticals on this list currently. There's a proposal to add 10, which hopefully is going to go through. And these are chemicals that we know have potentially ecotoxicological risk or risks to antimicrobial resistance. This is the watch list. So these are lists that are voluntary. So you're supposed to keep an eye on them, but you don't have to. There's 16 pharmaceuticals on this list as well. But so the data, because currently there's no pharmaceuticals on this list, there's 16, but this is a voluntary list. So we just don't have very much data at all. So monitoring is pretty poor. And of course, the UK is currently saying it's not sure if it's actually going to follow this. The way they're talking at the moment is that it's going to be weaker than this. So, and this is a recent study that looked at the chemicals or pharmaceuticals that are used in Europe. So there was 1,763 medicines registered with European, active pharmaceutical ingredients, registered with the European Medicines Agency. And they looked over the last, I think it was 23 years, if there's any data at all available on the monitoring levels, and they looked at which chemicals where we have got comprehensive toxicological data, and only this green bit here are the ones where we have, both monitoring and ecotox data. So for the vast majority, so for 2/3 of the chemicals being used, we don't have any monitoring data or any ecotoxicological data at all, and they're routinely, being used. We only have that for this small amount. So, we just don't know what's going on really. But there is a really great project being led by AstraZeneca to try and prioritise which compounds should be, because doing these ecotoxicological risk assessments is actually really expensive and takes a long time. So they can't possibly make their way through 1,763 very quickly. So they're prioritising which ones they should do first using sort of computer modelling. In terms of human health risk, we talked about antimicrobial resistance and the environmental risk of pollution. There's also increasing research now on the human exposome, they call it. Currently, this is focused on forever chemicals. Some pharmaceuticals are forever chemicals, but most aren't the kind of the really bad stuff that you find on frying pan. But we know that humans are exposed to pharmaceuticals either through bathing. We know that pharmaceuticals are present at low levels in drinking water. We know that the biosolids from sewage sludge that are applied to our agricultural fields, that's applied to food production fields. So we are exposed to all these chemicals. We don't know what the risks of this is. We don't know levels of bioaccumulation and what the long-term risks of that might be yet. So that's the kind of wait and see. There's also economic impacts of pharmaceutical pollution. So these are big figures on the left about how important the pharmaceutical industry is. It's hugely important for our economy, for research and development. It employs many, many people. This is 66,000. I think that's directly. And then, so we need to protect the pharmaceutical industry. We also, up to 50% of the pharmaceutical market is derived from nature. So the more we destroy biodiversity, the more of a long-term commercial risk this is as well. And then finally, these are sustainable finance initiatives. So in the corporate world, this is really important because if you want to invest money, increasingly investors are looking to invest in companies that are sustainable, environmentally sustainable. And at the moment, these frameworks that companies use to measure themselves in terms of their sustainability, these are really focused on carbon. And increasingly now, because biodiversity is becoming more, it's hitting the headlines, it's becoming, people are kind of waking up to this a bit more. These are increasingly now integrating biodiversity targets as well. So as these expand and hopefully start including pharmaceutical pollution as well as chemical pollution, this is a risk to the pharmaceutical industry as well. So that's the kind of doom and gloom about where we are now. Then this is quite easy. What do we want to achieve? We want to achieve sustainable pharmaceutical usage. There isn't really a definition of that at the moment. So the United Nations, this is the sort of standard definition of sustainability that everyone talks about. So it's meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And so we can sort of extrapolate that and say we need to find solutions to where we can profit from the human health and economic benefits that pharmaceuticals provide, but without compromising the long-term environmental health, human health, or economic health. So we need to find solutions to balance all of this. We can't just say, oh, well, you need to stop using pharmaceuticals. Obviously, that's not going to happen. So that's where we want to get to. And of course, we need more work on exactly what that looks like. But how can we get there? So in our work, we've found three main challenges in driving change. Firstly, is working with the complexity and the uncertainty. So I talked before about we don't know what's out there. We don't know what the risks are. We don't know enough about them. There's a huge amount of complexity and uncertainty. There's massive competing needs and interests across the healthcare, the pharmaceutical, the environmental sectors. We have to find solutions that balance these somehow. And a lot of the stakeholders involved, we've seen this through climate change, that there's short-term risks for them because the scale of what's needed is pretty big. There's financial or logistical challenges and they're short-term, but they need to overcome these for long-term gain. And those short-term challenges are putting them off making change. So we need to support them in overcoming these short-term risks. And so that's what the Pharma Pollution Hub is aiming to do. We're going to be the independent facilitator that drives a systems approach to try and deal with the complexity, the inclusive solutions, so bringing all the stakeholders together to kind of develop strategies together, and research for change. So we're based in the academic community, and we want to mobilise the academic community because we have all the resources and all these expertise of all these disciplines. We need to focus that on working with stakeholders. So to say, people already do come to me and say, either they want advice or they want, what are their options? What are the costs and benefits of this? Which one should they prioritise? Testing them out. there's all these questions that researchers could help them with. And so we want to try and mobilise the research community to drive change. And these two on the right, this is largely about collaboration, so about bringing people together. So we have a consortium of 70 people from across different sectors, and we work across 5 working groups. So that goes from public health, population health, pharmaceutical sector, healthcare decision making, pharmacy, sales, use and disposal, and environmental monitoring and management. So although we all work together, we have these different working groups to make sure that we look in the depth as well as the breadth. But then in terms of a systems approach, how do we do this? And so this is our preliminary work. This was published about 18 months ago. And I don't know how much you can read that from where you are, but we mapped the UK pharmaceutical, healthcare pharmaceutical system. So this is grey, this is the life cycle. So this is design, manufacture, distribution, this is healthcare. And then as you see these lines coming down, these are the different types of pollution. So you have water, air, land, international waste. And then this goes out into the environment here. And by looking at this is a very simplified map. This was only preliminary work, but there's take-home messages from this. When you look at it in this perspective, firstly, you see that there's almost no feedback from the environment into these decision-making steps up here. So this is licensing, reimbursement, procurement, prescribing. They are not currently thinking about the environment at all. Increasingly they are, because obviously the net zero mandate's coming in, but as far as I understand, they haven't been integrated yet. So this is the first thing. This is, in a way, a linear system at the moment, because pharmaceutical usage and need and demand is up here, and it's going out to the environment, and there's no feedback. The second thing is, as you can see, the more that comes in here, the more that goes out down there. And so we really need to look upstream. We really need to address the need and the desire for pharmaceuticals in the UK. And quite often, actually, people from public health, when I speak to them, they say, oh, I work in public health, it's got nothing to do with pharmaceutical pollution. And I say, well, actually, it's got everything to do with pharmaceutical pollution, because if we can invest more, if we can prevent the need for disease, and I know this has been an ongoing discussion ever since the NHS started, pretty much. If we can prevent disease, we can prevent the need for pharmaceuticals. Of course, there's also our culture and our kind of quick fix, people take drugs when they've got a headache rather than lying down. There's all sorts of aspects to this. It's not just, it's not simple. So there's various things you can see. Also, we can see the international waste. Any of our policies are not even taking responsibility at all at the moment for the international pollution that we are causing because we are using drugs that are produced abroad. And then more broadly, you can see that this is a complex system. There's all sorts of stakeholders involved. And that's why what they call it systems evolution. So individual interventions at little points across here are unlikely to have a large scale change, because this is a big system. And so what we need is all the stakeholders to come together and all play their part, and the whole system is going to have to evolve to become more sustainable together. And that's the whole premise of what we're doing with our systems approach. So that was the initial systems mapping. And now what we're doing is trying to understand the system for the UK, that means the breadth of it and the depth of it, and identify leverage points for change. So in order to do this, we're using the iceberg model. So the iceberg model, this is a model that you use for understanding complex issues. So in an iceberg, 90% of the iceberg is below the surface, typically. And this is the whole idea that what you see, 90% of the problem is actually, you can't see, you don't see what those factors are. And so if we say that the outcome is pharmaceutical pollution, there's a whole load of structures that are below the surface that you can't see that are driving pharmaceutical pollution. And there's a whole load of goals that underlie those structures. And then there's this cultural mindset that underlies all of it. And so what we're doing is we've been looking at this and trying with our consortium and applying this to each of the working groups. So for population health, sort of saying, okay, well, how are the structures of population health driving pharmaceutical pollution? What are the sector goals that are driving that? And what's the mindset that's driving that? And we've done that from all of them. And then we've also said, okay, well, if this is the situation, what are the leverage points for change that at each of these different levels? And that means that we're looking at leverage points, not just at the structures, the sort of low-hanging fruit, which is typically where people look. We're looking at the leverage points all the way, into the depths of society, if you like. So we've done that for each of the working groups, and then we bring it all back together. And we haven't got a name for this yet, whether it's a flotilla. Apparently you get a flotilla of icebergs, or a rose, or I don't know. But so we're bringing this all together and then looking at the leverage points across the system and the leverage points for change. And so essentially these fall into three categories. So we need to optimize these structures, the operational structures. We need to transform the goals, and we need to evolve our mindsets. And these are draft at the moment. But you can see the structures are in supply, use and waste. So simple things like packaging. Well, it sounds simple. None of this is actually simple, but include disposal and environmental risk information on pharmaceutical packaging. That's not on there at the moment, typically. Design pharmaceuticals to be less harmful or persistent in the environment. That is actually already happening quite, extensively across the pharmaceutical industry. Although obviously they're designing new drugs to be more greener, like benign by design, they call it. But this, about 90% of the drugs we use are generics that weren't designed to be this. So yeah, there's different leverage points across the system. There's all in terms of goals. There's goals for the economic sector, the healthcare sector, and the environmental sector, and then mindsets. What we actually found is, as we brought them together, the mindsets were typically very similar across all the working groups, and these are mindsets about valuing human health over the environmental health, and consumerism and things like this. And so these are kind of more deep-rooted, long-term change. But these are leverage points. They're not recommendations. Some of these things would be quite simple. Some of them, like outcomes-based healthcare, I said people have been trying to push this for many years, quite unsuccessfully, as far as I understand. So yeah, the idea is we've thrashed this out. We've got this roadmap, which is coming together now. And then in the long term, this would develop into a national action plan with proper recommendations, with metrics to measure where we're at, measure where we want to get to, and actual targets and timelines. And then moving forward, so the future, don't know what's on there, the future plans. So we're now setting this up as a charity. It's all about engagement, communication. We want to carry on bringing people together. We're already acting as a sort of central information point. We want to carry on doing strategies, monitoring, collect data on usage and wastage. I couldn't believe there's almost no data on pharmaceutical waste from healthcare at all. We want to, influence policymakers and together be a thought leader and promote this. So things like think tank workshops, which we've already started, really looking at really difficult challenges that people seem to be struggling with. If this is of interest, just finally, we have one of our upcoming think tank workshops. It's about integrating pharmaceutical pollution into sustainable finance initiatives. So that's coming up online in a few weeks. And then if you want, I will hopefully have more information about what we're doing in a couple of months, because this is all coming to a head now. And they've invited me to talk in July through the Southwest Pharmacy Research Network. So if anybody's interested in that, I'll hopefully have more information. If you want any more information about this, please email me or follow us on social media or look at our website. And otherwise, that's it. So thank you very much for listening, and thanks to all these people and the funders. Yeah, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Yeah, it's a complicated issue, isn't it? I mean, I was shocked there. I mean, one thing that, you know, of all the things that are monitored in the EU, no pharmaceuticals. Is that a coincidence, or is that industry pressure?
Well,
I find that quite extraordinary. What do you? The other thing you mentioned about AstraZeneca forming a list of ones they want to monitor. Is it right, do you think, that we should have the manufacturer deciding the list of the drugs that we should be monitoring, or should there be some independence there, because they're going to obviously try and choose the drugs, their drugs that look good and they know they've got the data for, whereas of course what we really need to know about is the ones that we don't know about.
I mean, the Premier project that I mentioned, that is, I'm still on Teams on it. I was just wondering.
You can, if you enlarge Teams, you can see them, and you can see whether there are any questions or anything.
Oh, okay.
But yeah.
So the Premier project that I mentioned that AstraZeneca are leading, that is being done in collaboration with researchers. So it has independent sort of oversight, if you like, and input. I mean, I think a lot of the big companies like AstraZeneca and Pfizer, the drugs they're now developing are the new drugs that are the biologics that are kind of, you know, they're less small molecule. That's where they're really getting their money from. And I think the ones, and they've been thinking about this benign by design for quite a long time, I mean, especially AstraZeneca are really leading on this. So I think the problem is actually some of the generic drugs now that they need to go back, because we've providing an environmental risk assessment's only been law since 2006. So before that, they didn't even have to provide any data at all. So quite a lot of the drugs that we use, we have no data on. And so a lot of those drugs, I think, are now being manufactured abroad. So I'm not sure how much incentive there is for AstraZeneca to kind of be biased, because a lot of the drugs they're already producing and getting the money from are the new ones. But yeah, I mean, also this costs such a huge amount of money that, you know, as I've learned, we need the pharmaceutical industry on board, because they are so influential, and they're such a core part of the problem. If we don't, then this isn't going to change.
Huge economic contribution. Of course, we haven't actually valued the value of nature, or the value of the earth, or the value of the planet. Of course, we didn't take that into consideration either. Questions from the floor? Has anyone got any questions to ask, please? Actually, what I'll ask you to do is use a microphone so people online can hear it. Does it work? Is that one working? You're going to have to shout, and we'll repeat it.
Or we can repeat it into the microphone.
So my question was that we know about the aging of the UK population, and we know that in the next 10 years, there will be more people with more comorbidities. And even I'm a doctor, so even our training program is now being designed like that, that we in the future can tackle more general population with more comorbidities. So this is something which is not going to change, and the people will be relying on more medication than this generation. Yeah. So is there anything we have to think from that perspective? Because some of the medication, like which comes, medical problem which comes on aging, they cannot be prevented.
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah, it's a good question.
So for those online, it was a question about the aging population, and the problem is only really going to get worse as the population ages. And the paradox here, of course, is that the population is aging because we've got better health care, and better public health, and better, water and better, environmental conditions and things. But it's a paradox. It's a success, but it's also a problem.
Yeah. So yeah, great question. And obviously, in the long term, we need to, if we can stop people needing drugs earlier, preventative health, then that's a good thing. So, they might live longer, but they have a less period that they need drugs for. But my understanding is that the patient management, that's one of our leverage points. Patient management is actually not that efficient, in terms of the amount of drugs that people are using. Now, I'm not a healthcare person here, so, you have to bear with me, but patients are seeing multiple different healthcare providers when they're in the community, at least. This could be managed a lot more effectively. There's also things like the wastage. People stockpile in the community. You hear stories about cupboards and cupboards full of unused medicines that people find when somebody maybe goes into a home, or and I don't think often they're necessarily taken back to the hospital. So I think there's a massive opportunity to make management of patients more efficient, and reduce wastage. And then, of course, if patients are going to need drugs, which they are to a certain extent, how can we then minimise the impact on the environment? So that's then looking at things like wastewater treatment plant upgrades, which is hugely expensive. I think in the future you might see things like, on the Water Framework Directive list, you've got things like metformin on there. There's talk about policies coming in whereby wastewater treatment providers are going to have to get a lot better at making sure that their water that goes out into the rivers meets the criteria of those lists. So they're going to have to upgrade it somehow. So what I'm saying is, I think there's no simple option, but I think there's ways to improve things at different areas along the way, and there's short-term and long-term options to at least make things better.
Other questions? Dr. Selly, who's a phenomenal prescriber. Is
that phenomenal prescriber in terms of volume, or
phenomenal prescriber in, I think, probably in the try not to prescribe.
Thanks, Kelly. I've got a few sort of comments. First of all, you cannot trust any pharmaceutical industry company at all. All the regulators, that's the FDA, the EMA, the MHRA, are all at least 70% funded by the pharmaceutical industry. So you're wondering why the EMA isn't doing anything. It's because the pharmaceutical industry has no inclination whatsoever. All of the evidence is that the pharmaceutical industry will only help you if it helps them. How much funding has your setup had from pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, zero. So the question.
Right, so this is critical. You're going to be seduced by the pharmaceutical industry.
Which is true.
Yeah. The question is, which sort of comment about the substantial influence of the pharmaceutical industry, and how much funding have we had from the industry? Well, actually, I said none, but that's partly because we have said no. We've had comments from the pharmaceutical industry that they might be interested in funding this, but it's tempting, because it's difficult to get funding for something, everybody really likes it, but it's not solid research. It's difficult to get funding, but it goes against everything that we're trying to do. We need to be independent, and the pharmaceutical industry is an important voice at the table, but they need to be a voice and not an influence, if you like. So yes. Sorry, carry on.
No, that's right, that's enough.
So we've got one question online, then we'll come to over there. Richard Paisley from Thornber was asking, would compulsory recycling of blister packs be a great way to start? Do we, any pharmacists here, do we actually recycle in the blister packs in the hospital?
No, the waste regulations don't permit us to do that within the hospital
But
environment.
we're doing it in the community, because our local pharmacists...
Different waste regs apply for acute trusts compared to within the community. So currently, the regulations don't permit us to do
That's
that.
a nonsense, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you could actually give all your blister packs to members of staff going home, and they could take them to their local pharmacy and be recycled there.
Yeah.
It's
That would be the best
extraordinary.
solution.
Yeah, and well, and just to, so I think any recycling or any waste management would be better. There is also things like, you know, even just if we just get people to start taking the drugs back to the pharmacy, you know, is there a way that we can make that more accessible? So, you know, could you have in the supermarket the way you recycle batteries? Could you do that? Obviously, there's risks around this because of you know, health risks, but you know, are there ways of making the efficiency of return better, and also recycling drugs, because as soon as a drug leaves a pharmacy premises, you're not allowed to re-prescribe it. And there are actually trials of mainly in Holland, where they're looking at sort of special seals on drug packages, and they're looking at if under the right conditions a drug is returned, and these sort of smart seals show that it's not had high temperatures or it's not been opened, can we reuse them? And so that they are looking into this.
Other question, sorry, yeah, please.
What's the proper way to, perhaps I should ask behind me, the proper way to dispose of the cupboard full of out-of-date drugs that you've discovered in a dead or otherwise departed old person, for instance?
Yeah, so the question
Put it
is,
in a reservoir in Brixton.
yeah,
Well,
what's the proper way of disposing of
it goes
drugs?
into landfill, surely.
Well, so what the recommended way is incineration. So any drugs that go to that you take back to the pharmacy will go to incineration.
So that's the plastic blisters, the metal, cardboard.
Well, as far as I understand, the cardboard, I actually don't know what that's a good question. I don't know what the pharmacist does with the plastic, the blister packs, if they're in them. I imagine they probably put the whole thing in, but I don't know that.
Community pharmacists can now are recycling blister packs.
Right.
How do you do that? You put new pills in the old blisters?
No, I think it's a complex process. It's obviously done centrally somewhere, because the blister packs are made of plastic and a bit of foil on the top, and they're separating them out. And they have now got, I don't know exactly how, but it's a new technology that they can now actually make it cost effective to leach off the plastic and reuse the metal and recycle it in some way. And whether it goes to new blister packs, I don't know, or whether it goes to other products.
What about the pill inside?
Well, the pills, I think, are all actually incinerated,
yeah.
high temperature incineration. And the point of that, why that is better, is it's usually, if it's done properly, high temperature incineration is usually linked to an energy from waste plant. So the effluent from the incinerator is very, very carefully controlled, and you get actually some energy from it. And that's what happens to our hospital waste. The fact is, it's actually shipped all the way down to Plymouth, I think, to be destroyed there, because the high temperature, they didn't build the plant big enough here in Exeter to deal with Albert, so it has carbon miles and 40 miles to go to Plymouth. But if it's done properly,
yeah.
That's why medicine should be returned to the pharmacist rather than going to the local council refuge site, where, as you say, it will go into landfill.
But also because when you incinerate it at high temperatures, and it has to be really high temperatures, it denatures the chemicals. So they end up going into their sort of very small sort of constituent compounds, some of which though can also, you know, even as an incineration product, that's contributing towards climate change. So, you know, it doesn't end up being carbon dioxide, it ends up being all sorts of things. So yeah, it's multiple reasons, but mainly from a chemical pollution perspective, it's to denature these complex toxic compounds.
So you had a question?
I have Sam Francis. I'm just interested to know if you're working with regards to the influencing the prescribing component, because I'm aware there's an organisation called Newmaker who've developed the sort of medicines carbon footprint tools. It would be really interesting to see that sort of approach being adopted as part of local formularies. I think we're some way from that, but I just wondered if you're working with Newmaker or anything like that in terms of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so the question was about if we're working with Newmaker and looking at prescribing and integrating this into prescribing decision making. So yes, we are. Newmaker, the CEO of Newmaker is in our consortium. They are really focused on carbon. I mean, they're fantastic. The tool they've developed is really great. It's looking at the carbon footprint of medicines, not the pollution footprint. We're also in our consortium. We work with the One Health Breakthrough Partnership in Scotland, who are really leading this, and they've been looking at projects that try to look at eco-prescribing. But it's very difficult because it's sort of saying, right, if you get two drugs and the health outcomes are the same, this one's better for the environment, and this, than this one, I'm not sure how many times that's actually possible, and of course there's an economic component to this as well. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about this is sort of going away from that a bit. Well, the idea is that that's where you're at the point of prescribing. Ideally, this needs to be brought into decision making much more upstream, because it's difficult to make that decision at the prescribing stage for the reasons I talked about. But if this is brought in at licensing or health technology assessment, it's much easier to integrate it upstream. And at the level of prescribing, all you have the choice of are two drugs. That's not a big choice. If you look at the level of investment, you can, if you take a step back and look at the big picture, you can prescribe this drug, or you can prescribe this intervention to prevent them getting that there in the first place. These aren't currently looked at as alternatives, and I know it doesn't affect you as sort of people on the ground, but from a policymaker perspective, these should be more, prevention versus prescription. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent there, but yeah.
Any other? It's come up to 2 o'clock. So any questions online, outstanding, or any other questions? Four takeaways, I think, for the doctor that is here. Obviously, think before you prescribe. Don't just try and think carefully about whether the drug is actually necessary. Talk about it amongst yourself, discuss it with your team. Have that conversation with patients about disposing of old medications, and say, if any of these aren't used, take them to your local pharmacy. And thirdly, whenever you have any contact with anybody in the drug industry, or your next rep, which you will have because they will pester you throughout your career, ask them about eco-pharmacovigilance. Ask them what their company is doing. The answer will be they don't know. And you say, just keep asking them, so the message actually gets sent further upstream, that actually this is important to health and care professionals. And the fourth thing is systems thinking. Everything is connected. We have to actually think, it's not, when you make a decision about an individual, we are making a decision about the wider environment, the wider planet, and the future generations. And that's really what we need to do as health and care professionals, is think about what our long-term impact will be, because we all have a responsibility for it, whether we're a patient, whether we're a prescriber, whether we're a dispenser, or whatever. Thank you very much for coming. Our next talk is an evening talk by Professor Maggie Shepherd, who is well known to all of you, in this lecture theatre, 6 o'clock on Tuesday the 4th of June, and what does a genetic diagnosis mean for patients, a nursing career in monogenetic diabetes. Thank you, and thank you to Kelly.